CNN hosted another debate featuring Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz, and this time they were both accompanied by Senators Maria Cantwell and Tim Scott. And at the last tax reform debate, I think it was clear that Bernie Sanders destroyed Ted Cruz. He absolutely wiped the floor with him. This time, I still think Bernie Sanders probably won and was more persuasive. However, I don't think it was as thorough of an ass beating as it was last time. And this is because as I'm watching this, I'm trying to pretend as though I don't follow politics and I'm just an average viewer. And when you listen to Bernie Sanders and juxtapose what he's saying against Ted Cruz and Tim Scott, I mean, even though they are lying through their teeth and they're lying about everything and they're trying to obscure facts, they are good debaters. This wasn't necessarily Ted Cruz's best performance, but I think that Tim Scott was actually pretty persuasive at trying to basically make it seem as though this tax plan is something that it isn't. With that being said, when you put Bernie Sanders' message against Tim Scott's, I think that Bernie Sanders is more persuasive because he has facts on his side, real facts on his side. He cites objective studies and not right-wing think tank studies. And also, he's the most popular politician in the country, so he already cultivated that trust that people like Ted Cruz and Tim Scott just don't have. So I think that Bernie Sanders, in pointing out specific ways in which this tax plan screws over the middle class, I think he won. Now, I'll include a link to the full debate down below because I can't cover the entirety of the debate. It was an hour and a half, but I do want to showcase parts of the debate to you that did stand out to me. So basically, the debate starts out with Bernie Sanders just laying out the facts. This is a tax plan that will raise your taxes. If you are a single mother, if you're part of the middle class, your taxes will inevitably have to go up. And this led to a pretty heated exchange between him and Tim Scott.
According to the Tax Policy Center, which is a nonpartisan tax organization, 87 million middle-class households would see their taxes go up by the end of the decade. Now, interestingly enough, what they did in their bill is they made the benefits that go to working people in the middle class temporary. But the corporate tax breaks are permanent. So I'm afraid to have to tell you, not only will your taxes likely go up, but when these guys are finished with cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, and other important programs for working families, it is likely you and your kid will be in worse shape.
Well, patently false, number one. Listen, we can debate the issues, but we can't debate the facts.
That's right.
And here's what the Joint Committee on Taxation says. In her income bracket, her tax will go down, not up, down.
Well, speaking of the Joint Committee on Taxation, on average, what they say is the Senate Republican tax plan raises taxes on American families earning $75,000 or less by the end of the decade. That's what they say.
I'd like to bring in Senator Cruz and Senator Cantwell.
One time. I think the word I'm looking for is hogwash.
Really?
Yes, absolutely.
Then you better talk to the Joint.
Well, let me just.
So the thing about Tim Scott is that what he's saying all sounds nice, but they don't talk about all the negative components of this tax plan that will inevitably screw over the middle class. And when Bernie Sanders points out facts that don't coincide with the narrative they're trying to push, well then, what do? They pivot to attacking Bernie Sanders' character. So we had Ted Cruz assert that Bernie Sanders just wants to raise your taxes. That's all he wants to do.
Bernie was very explicit. He was very candid. He said he wants to raise your taxes. He wants to raise everyone's taxes. That's the difference. Ted? The Democrats want to raise your taxes.
To provide
and what the Republicans are, what the Republicans are doing is cutting your taxes. You're right. They want to raise your taxes, and then they want to spend your money. We want to cut your taxes and let you spend your money.
No, you want to cut taxes for the billionaires. Maybe you'll disagree.
No, we're talking about cutting taxes right there.
But here are the facts.
Here are the facts.
60% of the tax breaks you are giving your friends coming from your campaign contributors, the 1%.
Now, that wasn't the only time that Ted Cruz tried to claim that Bernie Sanders wants to raise taxes on the middle class. And what he's saying is technically true, because if you do have a Medicare for All system, you raise taxes on the middle class and everyone else to pay for that. But what he's not telling you is that in raising taxes on the middle class, they're still going to have more money in their pocket because they're not going to be paying for their monthly health insurance premium. Now, Ted Cruz actually included a quote that Bernie Sanders said last time, where he just takes Bernie Sanders out of context. So he quotes Bernie Sanders out of context to make it appear as though he wants to raise your taxes when he's not explaining what Bernie Sanders said. Now, he actually did this, and Bernie Sanders called him out on it, and this led to a complete beatdown of Ted Cruz by Bernie Sanders, because he said, if you're going to use my quotes, then use them correctly. This is how the exchange went.
Here's what Bernie said. This is a quote. So yes, to answer your question, Jake, if we can explain to people, yeah, you're going to be paying more in taxes. Now, he said it's going to be a progressive tax system. The wealthy are going to pay their fair share, not the middle class, not the working class, but everybody will pay some more. So you're a single mom working, he says you're going to pay some more. You're a small business owner, he says you're going to pay some more. And the reason is there aren't enough millionaires and billionaires to pay for all the socialism that Bernie and the Democrats want to give away.
This is why politics in America stinks.
Thank you.
That's right. Because you forgot the other half of the sentence. And what the other half of that statement said is, yeah, you may pay more in taxes if you're in the middle class for a Medicare for all single-payer health care bill, but you're not going to have to pay your private premiums to an insurance company, and you will be better off. Now, Ted stays up nights worrying that somebody's going to pay more in taxes. Apparently, you don't worry that there are families in America paying $15,000 or $20,000 a year for insurance to private companies.
Well, Bernie,
that's okay for you.
Bernie, I do worry about it.
Yeah, well, you didn't give my whole point.
But Obamacare caused that.
Obamacare did not cause that.
So Bernie, a couple of simple facts.
But one point. Let me just say, all right, and I'll give it back to you. Next time you quote me, give the whole quote.
Now, what's funny to me is that after Ted Cruz was lambasting Bernie Sanders for wanting to raise taxes on the middle class, Ted Cruz received a question from the audience about salt, which is one thing that does help members of the middle class. It helps the upper middle class as well, but basically, removing salt would harm members of the middle class. And Ted Cruz admitted that, yeah, removing salt would result in a tax increase on the middle class.
This tax reform bill also includes a large middle-class tax increase because it eliminates the state and local income and property tax deduction, otherwise known as the SALT deduction. Do you believe hiking taxes on the middle class is in line with conservative principles?
Well, thank you for your question. Thank you for your support in the primaries last year. Absolutely not. And you've highlighted what is my single biggest concern with the tax bill as it is now.
Now, there were some other moments in the debate that were pretty embarrassing for Ted Cruz and also Tim Scott. But first, when it comes to Ted Cruz, him, along with other Republicans, they insist that Democrats are being obstructionist and that they're not trying to help them create this legislation. But the fact of the matter is that Republicans are shutting Democrats out of the process. Democrats, there's a lot of corporate Democrats that would be willing to go along with raising taxes on the middle class in order to pay for corporate tax cuts and tax cuts to the wealthy. Look at Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Manchin. They might vote for this anyway. And yet, they're claiming that Democrats don't want to work with them. All we have to do is look at the corporate Democrats like Ron Wyden and Joe Manchin and see that that's bullshit, that's false. So Bernie Sanders explained exactly what happened. Democrats were not included in this process. They were shut out.
There are a number of opportunities for our friends on the left to come to the table, but they have said no, thank you.
Actually, there are zero opportunities for progressives to come to the table.
You've missed
because
the last
you
9
guys
months. You've missed the last 9
because you locked the door. Because you made a decision to go forward with reconciliation. You have 52 votes in the Senate. You need 50 plus the vice president to pass it. And that's what you did. You decided from day one that you would not involve Maria, myself, or any other Democrat in this process. Now, if you had, what would have happened is, yeah, we would have raised the earned income tax credit. We would have dealt very significantly with childcare. But you know what? We would not have given 60% of the tax breaks to the top 1%. They made a political decision that they were going to do it alone, hoping that they would get 50 votes. Whether they will or not, we will find out soon enough. But this was never an effort to involve Democrats in the process.
Now, one part of the debate that was really embarrassing for Tim Scott was when he randomly tried to assert that this tax plan doesn't want to repeal the estate tax. Are you serious? Republicans have been trying for decades to repeal the estate tax. Donald Trump certainly wants to repeal the estate tax because this specifically would benefit his own family. So what are you talking about? So he says, oh, well, that's not in the Senate plan, it's in the House plan. But Bernie Sanders made him look like a fool when he asked Ted Cruz. And of course, Ted Cruz said, yeah, we are in favor of repealing the estate tax.
Our plan does not repeal the estate tax. That is a false statement.
In terms of the estate tax, the House bill does repeal the estate tax
we're in the
over
Senate.
6 years.
We're in the Senate, though.
I'm more than aware of that, but
We're
I
good.
think
Just want to
they're
make sure.
also
Just want to
going
double check
into a
myself.
conference committee. But I read Ted's stuff. Ted, you agree with repealing the estate tax? You've said that many, many times.
Absolutely.
All right, there you go.
So that wasn't a very good look for Tim Scott because it made him look like the liar that he is. He was basically exposed as someone who was trying to obfuscate the truth and change reality to suit his narrative. Now, that wasn't the only time that Tim Scott was embarrassed because he was just fact-checked left and right. I mean, he kept trying to perpetuate these false claims about this tax bill, and each time he made an assertion, it was debunked. So, for example, there was a CEO that actually fact-checked Tim Scott, and he destroyed the idea of trickle-down economics in general. So, watch a CEO utterly embarrass Tim Scott.
In my experience as a CEO at a public company, I can tell you that our investors would have been delighted at any tax cut that improved our profitability. But it would not have led to more hiring or an increase in wages. It just wouldn't. It never came up. What do you say to employees of companies like mine and many millions of others who won't get higher wages as a direct result of lower corporate taxes? But the corporate investors and the executives like myself will get a very large benefit.
Economists on both sides of the aisle agree that the corporate tax is a burden shared by the employees of the company and the consumers of those products.
So Tim Scott is literally arguing here that higher corporate tax rates actually hurt the employees as well. And if we cut the corporate tax rates, that will help employees, because the reasoning, I'm guessing, is that if these companies don't pay more in taxes, they'll use that extra revenue and give that to their employees. Really? Is that what you think? I was born at night, but not last night, because we all know damn well that those CEOs of these large multinational corporations like Walmart, they're just going to pocket that money. They're going to take home bonuses. They're not going to give a damn about their workers. And we have evidence for this because this is what they do every time you guys cut their taxes. You just exacerbate the already huge problem that is income and wealth inequality. So, I mean, there were these types of moments that just made Tim Scott and Ted Cruz, of course, look like fools. But I mean, they weren't the only ones that looked really dumb, because Maria Cantwell had a really bad moment in the debate because essentially Tim Scott kept bringing up corporate Democrats that agree that the corporate tax rate in America is too high. And that prompted Maria Cantwell to defend Democrats who are right-wing, who think we should cut the corporate tax rate. And she basically said, we're a big tent party. And the argument she made was terrible.
You know, Ted, I really thought about this issue of you trying to divide the Democrats. But, you know, we're a big tent party. And there's room for Bernie and there's room for me. The difference is you guys keep trying to isolate your party. It used to be there was everywhere from Susan Collins to Jeff Sessions. But instead, you guys took on people like Dick Lugar, and guess what? We got Joe Donnelly. And then you put somebody out there in Missouri, and we got Claire McCaskill. So you keep narrowing your tent, and I'm fine with our big tent.
So the way that she is characterizing both parties, I do think that she's correct. The Republican Party, as they become increasingly right-wing, they narrow their base, and as Democrats move further and further to the right, they are expanding that tent. And it's not just that they're expanding it and they're trying to encompass center right and far left. They're not. They're moving away from the left, and not even the far left, just the left in general. So in creating this, quote, big tent, they've created a tent that's big enough to include corporate Democrats who are right-wing, who are moderate Republicans, and that's why they're losing. So in basically calling out corporate Democrats that want to slash the corporate tax rate, Tim Scott shouldn't be putting Maria Cantwell in a defensive position. What she should say is, oh, well, thank you for telling me about these corporate Democrats like Ron Wyden that want to slash the corporate tax rate. I'll remember to primary them. But of course, I mean, I'm kidding myself to think that she would even think in these terms, because Maria Cantwell, she is a corporate Democrat herself. She might not be as right-wing as some Democrats like Joe Manchin and Heidi Heitkamp, but she's no progressive. Now, one thing that really irked me throughout this debate was how they talked about, we have this really high corporate tax rate and we're just not competitive. And finally, I believe it was like halfway through, Bernie Sanders finally called them on this bullshit.
For the record here, Tim, I think it was, talked about the corporate tax rate being 35%.
Yes.
That's correct. That is the nominal rate. But Tim, you understand.
Yes, I understand the effective rate.
That's right. That there's a great deal of difference between the effective rate. As I understand it, according to the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, large profitable corporations pay just 14% of their profits in federal income taxes. There's a big difference between the nominal rate of 35% and what they pay. And what they end up paying, by the way, is somewhere near what they pay in the OECD. The only point that I wanted to make is you agree that the effective tax rate is not 35%. It's close to 14%.
I would suggest that that is also true throughout the world in our competitors. So when you look at our position versus our competitors, when Ireland's at 12%, when the UK is heading towards 17 or 18%, when the OECD average is around 22%, the reality of it is at 35%, even when you lower it down to our effective rate, when those countries do the same thing, we find ourselves at a strong
Senator Sanders, we have to leave it there. Thank you.
So when you're talking about corporate taxes, you can't have a genuine discussion about it unless you point out differences between the nominal and the effective tax rates. And that's what Republicans, they try to talk about nominal tax rates and how high it is, but they don't tell you about how these large multinational corporations take advantage of loopholes that make them pay, in some cases, $0. Now, Tim Scott actually put forward a pretty good objection to what Bernie Sanders said here. He said, well, when you look at countries like Ireland, who have a 12% nominal rate, well, their effective rate still comes down, and that makes them more competitive than us. But what he's arguing for is basically allowing them to pay next to nothing. Our nominal tax rate is 35%, and corporations pay less than 10% and sometimes $0 in many instances. So he's basically arguing effectively for the elimination of the corporate tax rate. You can't do that unless you raise taxes on the middle class. So I wish Bernie Sanders had more time to call him out, because that's basically what Tim Scott is arguing for. He's arguing for $0 in corporate taxes, and guess who's got to pick up that burden? That's going to be you and I. That's not going to be the rich. So these politicians here on the stage, all but Bernie, they're so disingenuous, and it frustrates me to no end. Now, another thing that frustrated me was the way that Ted Cruz and Tim Scott dodged the question, essentially, when a graduate student asked why they're willing to raise taxes on grad students and basically make it so they can't complete their schooling.
The average graduate student at my university currently makes $15,000 a year. If we were to be taxed on the tuition benefits that we receive, many of us would be paying almost a third of our salary toward federal taxes. At other universities with higher tuition rates, the situation is even worse. When the Senate and the House bills head to reconciliation, this question is for both Senators Cruz and Scott, really, how will you guarantee that graduate students don't bear the burden of new corporate tax cuts? Will you commit to keeping new taxes on graduate tuition waivers out of the final plan?
I'll just tell you that it's in the House plan, it's not in the Senate plan. I believe that the Senate plan will emerge out of the conference being the plan that we go forward with. So the good news is, the answer is yes, number one. Number two, when you look at the long-term opportunities for a student coming out of college, when our unemployment rate's at 4%, and our economic growth is at 3%, your wages are going up. This is good news. It's a good time to be you.
I agree with you. We shouldn't be taxing tuition benefits. It's not in the Senate bill, and I'm quite confident it won't be in the final bill.
Yeah, so she didn't get a substantive answer to the question that she asked. And understand, when she said she makes $15,000, when she takes home $15,000 after her college pays for her tuition and whatnot, that's actually one of the higher rates, because when I was a grad student, I was grateful to have funding. They paid for my tuition, but the take home for me, get this, $300 a month. Now, I would end up making more money, so it was more along the lines of $800, because other professors would have me grade exams. They'd have me grade research papers, and I'd get paid about $12 to $15 an hour, depending on the professor. for doing that. But if I couldn't get those extra jobs that I was able to pick up, it would be $300 a month base. So she had one of the higher programs. So if you tax us, we get basically nothing. So that's why I was so frustrated when they didn't answer her question. They said, oh, that's not in the Senate bill. Not good enough. We don't know that you're not going to settle to get this bill through because we all know that your donors want you to deliver on corporate tax cuts. So if this doesn't get removed from the Senate version, are you still going to vote for it? I think we all know the answer is yes. And they didn't give her a good enough answer. So that was irritating to me just because I have personal experience and I can attest to the fact that this will absolutely push graduate students out of schooling. If we were taxed on what they consider revenue, which is our college paying for tuition, you just couldn't finish school. It's that simple. Now, I want to end this discussion of the debate appropriately in Bernie Sanders' closing statement because he lays it out here pretty clearly. This is what's at stake.
We live in a moment in history where we have more income and wealth inequality than any time since the late 1920s. Top 0.1% now owns as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Top 1% earns 52% of all income. The idea that 60% of the tax benefits in the Republican plan would go to the top 1% is beyond absurd. Our job is to grow the middle class and the working class of this country, not give more wealth to the people on top. Our vision is to create an economy and a government that works for all of us, not just wealthy campaign contributors. This legislation should be defeated. We should then sit down and develop tax policy that works for working families, not wealthy campaign contributors.
So in the end, I would highly encourage you to watch the full debate. It was only an hour and a half. I can't get to everything, but look, the Republican Party, since they don't have facts on their side, they have to lie. They have to obfuscate. They have to tap dance around the truth and facts in order to make themselves look good. They have to lob these personal attacks against Bernie Sanders, call him a socialist as if that's a bad thing, in order to make themselves look good. But the fact remains that the Republican Party is pushing vociferously for these tax cuts because their biggest donors, the Koch network, claimed that if they don't get this done, they will cut off their access to the piggy bank, and Republicans want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So they are doing this. They're pushing relentlessly for this bill to appease their donors. And that's why they're not going to vote against this bill if taxing grad students isn't taken out. They're not going to vote for it. Tim Scott wouldn't vote against this bill if the estate tax is still repealed. It's bullshit. They're doing this because they're corrupt and they're doing it to appease their donors. And I think overall, the average viewer will see that. But at the same time, they're good at their craft, and that craft is lying. So the American people, they're going to have to decide. But regardless of what conclusion they come to, this bill will be voted on, and even if it may not have support from a majority of Americans, I don't even know if a plurality support it, it may very well pass anyway, because the elites and the special interests, they get what they want in this country.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.